There are wars that change the world. Wars of conquest, ideology, revolution. And then there's the Toledo War. A war so magnificently stupid it could only have happened in America. It had everything. No battles, one stabbing, a few dozen, confused militiamen, thousands of indignant farmers, and a level of pettiness so sustained it practically deserves its own monument. Imagine a war where the deadliest weapon is paperwork, where generals carry fountain pens instead of sabers, where men march bravely toward bureaucratic inconvenience. This is that war, the Toledo War, a tragic comedy of borders, maps, and human ego. But let's begin at the heart of all great American conflicts, a cartographical misunderstanding. Our story starts in the early 1800s, when the United States was still trying to figure out what shape it wanted to be. New states were popping up like mushrooms after rain, and nobody quite agreed on where one ended and the next began. If you asked a surveyor to point out a border, he'd probably just squint at a river, draw a wobbly line, and hope no one checked. Enter the villains of our sleepy little saga, Michigan Territory and the great state of Ohio. Two neighbors, two dreamers. One thin, muddy strip of land, about 5 miles wide and 50 miles long. Known as the Toledo Strip, Ohio wanted it. Michigan wanted it. Neither could spell compromise. Now you might be asking, what was so special about this little strip of swampy, mosquito-infested frontier land? Did it have gold, timber, mountains? No. It had Toledo, and Toledo at the time wasn't even Toledo. It was a few cabins, some enterprising frogs, and a lot of mud with delusions of grandeur. But location, as they say, is everything. Whoever owned Toledo controlled access to the Maumee River, a potential trade hub connecting Lake Erie to the interior. To the frontier mind, it was the perfect place to build a bustling port, or at least a town that wasn't entirely underwater. In spring. Unfortunately, maps from the early 19th century were less scientific documents and more vibes-based art projects. The trouble began with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, that famous piece of legislation that laid out how new states would join the Union. It said Ohio's northern border should run east-west from the southern tip of Lake Michigan. But early maps, wildly inaccurate maps, mind you, placed Lake Michigan further north than it actually was, meaning Ohio's border, if drawn that way, would give it Toledo. Later, more accurate maps revealed that Lake Michigan's southern tip was actually lower, which on paper moved the border south, handing the Toledo Strip to Michigan. And that's how America ended up with two sets of people waving two sets of maps, both yelling, "Ours!" Ohio, being a state, immediately went full main character. Energy? It declared the strip part of its territory, printed official-looking documents, and sent surveyors to mark the line. Michigan, still technically a territory, not yet a state, took this as a personal insult. Its young, ambitious Governor Stevens T. Mason was not about to let Ohio push him around. He was 24 years old, fiery, and reportedly had the kind of self-confidence that only comes from being too young to understand consequences. Thus began the great Midwestern standoff of 1835, a war fought not with cannons, but with paperwork, arrests, and strongly worded letters. To the casual observer, this might seem like a simple border dispute. But no, this was something far deeper. This was about pride, identity, petty revenge. It was about who got to say, "That swamp is mine." Both sides began mobilizing. Ohio's governor, Robert Lucas, called up his militia. Thousands of men, many of whom had never seen combat, but were well acquainted with corn. Michigan, not to be outdone, raised its own militia, equally brave, equally confused, and equally unprepared for the sheer humidity of the region. The two armies marched toward each other through mud, mosquitoes, and mild irritation, meeting near the Maumee River where they promptly did nothing. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody charged. The most exciting military action was probably someone tripping over a log. But in the minds of politicians, this was war. Newspapers fanned the flames. Angry editorials accused each side of tyranny, fraud, and, most scandalous of all, poor app reading. Ohioans called Michigan a lawless backwater. Michiganders called Ohio a political swamp, which, to be fair, was geographically accurate. And while all this chest-puffing continued, poor Toledo, the city at the center, of it all, mostly just wanted to know which government to pay taxes to. The residents, it seems, didn't particularly care which flag flew overhead, as long as somebody fixed the roads and kept the peace. But as is the way of things, reason was in short supply, and pride was on clearance. Then came the moment that escalated the conflict from mildly inconvenient argument to official historical farce. Ohio's surveyors, under orders to mark the border according to Ohio's map, entered the disputed area. Michigan, in a display of youthful enthusiasm, decided to arrest them all. Not attack, not shoot, just arrest them as one might. Detain a group of overzealous birdwatchers. The Ohioans, deeply offended, protested. Michigan doubled down. Ohio threatened legal action. And so the stage was set for one of the pettiest, most anticlimactic wars in American history. Somewhere, George Washington's ghost must have sighed deeply. But do not be fooled by the lack of gunfire. For what the Toledo War lacked in violence, it made up for in commitment. Both sides kept sending militias. Both sides issued proclamations. Both sides genuinely believed they were in the right, and that the fate of the Republic hinged on this muddy patch of contested swamp. It was democracy's most gloriously ridiculous moment, when two governments nearly went to war over a town that barely existed. And yet, beneath the absurdity, there was something oddly human about it all. The desire to be seen, to be respected, to not let anyone push you off your map. It's a feeling we all understand, even if most of us don't express it by mobilizing a militia of angry farmers with muskets from 1812. The Toledo War, in many ways, wasn't about land at all. It was about pride in the age of uncertainty, about young states trying to define themselves in a nation that was still learning what united really meant. But don't get too sentimental just yet. There's plenty more absurdity ahead. Because as we'll soon see, this war will include more shouting, more arrests, one dramatic stabbing, and an ending so anticlimactic it could put a caffeine addict to sleep. So, take a deep breath. The air smells faintly of swamp, muskets, and misplaced ambition. Our war of maps has only just begun. Picture it. Spring, 1835. The fields of Ohio hum with anticipation. The forests of Michigan whisper with righteous indignation. Somewhere between them, a 5-mile-wide patch of damp earth sits quietly, wondering why everyone's making such a fuss. Governor Robert Lucas of Ohio has decided that this nonsense must end, but only on his terms. He sends in surveyors to redraw the border along what Ohio calls the Harris Line, named after surveyor William Harris, who may have been competent, but was also tragically alive during a time when GPS meant guess pretty seriously. Meanwhile, Michigan's Governor Stevens T. Mason, all of 24 years old and absolutely thrilled to be part of a historical event, orders his own men to patrol the area. His militia, several hundred strong, marches into the swamp like they're on a quest for honor and maybe tetanus. The situation is tense. Letters fly faster than bullets ever will. Lucas declares Michigan's arrests of Ohioan surveyors illegal. Mason declares Lucas's existence personally offensive. Newspapers in both regions publish editorials filled with patriotic outrage and deeply questionable geography. By April, both sides are so sure war is imminent that they begin calling up thousands of volunteers. Michigan's militia camps out near the Maumee River, complete with drummers, banners, and a contagious sense of self-importance. Ohio responds by stationing troops nearby. The two armies are separated by a few miles, a lot of mud, and one very confused population of frogs. Then, finally, the first and only armed confrontation occurs, the legendary Battle of Phillips Corners. Now, battle is perhaps an overstatement. It was more of a bureaucratic misunderstanding with costumes. It began when a group of Ohio surveyors, again those heroes of compass and quill, wandered into the disputed area to mark Ohio's version of the border. Michigan militiamen, led by a captain whose name history has mercifully forgotten, intercepted them. The Michiganders surrounded the surveyors and shouted something historically appropriate, like, "Halt," in the name of correct cartography. The surveyors, bless them, refused to stop. They continued marking trees and pounding stakes, proving that defiance doesn't always require courage. Sometimes it just requires being very bad at reading a room. The Michiganders, growing impatient, fired their muskets into the air as warnings. A polite, "Hey, we're serious" kind of volley. The Ohioans dropped their tools and surrendered immediately, because nothing says war hero like deciding a line on a tree isn't worth dying for. The Michigan militia arrested 9 surveyors, confiscated their equipment, and marched them off like prized trophies of bureaucratic valor. Not a single person was hurt. It was the least bloody battle in American history, unless you count the mosquito casualties, which were significant. Governor Mason, delighted by this display of firm yet gentle justice, reported back to Washington that Michigan had defended its sovereignty with great dignity. Ohio, meanwhile, declared that Michigan's actions were tyrannical and possibly French. President Andrew Jackson, the nation's chief chaos enthusiast, was less than thrilled. The last thing he wanted was an actual armed conflict between a state and a territory over what he privately called a wet patch of nowhere. But Jackson, ever the politician, also couldn't afford to offend Ohio, a powerful state full of electoral votes and people who grew things he liked to eat. So, in an act of supreme indecision, Jackson attempted to please both sides by doing absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, Michigan wasn't backing down. Governor Mason, dubbed the Boy Governor, leaned fully into the drama. He dressed impeccably, wrote fiery proclamations, and gave speeches about Michigan's destiny. He told his citizens that their honor was at stake, that to lose the Toledo Strip would be an unforgivable insult. The citizens, bless them, rallied behind him with enthusiasm. Hundreds volunteered for militia service. Farmers left their plows to grab muskets older than their grandfathers. It became a matter of pride. After all, if Ohio wanted to be ridiculous, Michigan could be ridiculous with feeling. One Michigan militiaman later recalled that they were ready to march at a moment's notice, provided it wasn't raining because, and I quote, "the mud was biblical." Ohio, equally dramatic, called special sessions of the legislature, passed resolutions, and even carved the disputed land into a new county. Lucas County, named, of course, after their own governor. The county existed entirely on paper, a sort of imaginary jurisdiction floating somewhere above the swamp. At this point, the Toledo War was less a military conflict and more a very loud argument conducted through state-issued stationery. Both sides continued to prepare for the worst while secretly hoping someone else would figure it out. Then came the only instance of real bloodshed, or, to be precise, minor puncture wounds. It happened in July 1835, when a Michigan sheriff attempted to arrest a man named Major Benjamin Stickney, a Toledo resident and passionate Ohio loyalist. Stickney resisted, chaos ensued, and in the scuffle his son, whose actual legal name was Stickney, yes, really, stabbed the sheriff with a penknife. The wound was minor, the sheriff survived, and the Stickneys became the most famous family in the world of cartographic-based knife crime. Newspapers erupted. Ohioan presses called the stabbing an act of self-defense. Michigan papers declared it a vile assault upon law and order. The sheriff, likely bandaged and annoyed, probably wished everyone would calm down and go home. But instead, both sides doubled, down again. Mason issued arrest warrants for the Stickneys. Ohio refused to hand them over. The atmosphere of mutual pettiness was now so thick you could spread it on toast. By August, the militias had settled into a rhythm. March around, glare at each other, write strongly worded letters, go home for lunch. The soldiers were reportedly in good spirits, though their officers struggled to maintain discipline among men who would rather be farming than pretending to invade their neighbors. At one point, Michigan's militia requisitioned barrels of whiskey for morale, which explains much about how they managed to take a bloodless war so personally. Meanwhile, Washington finally decided to intervene. President Jackson, now deeply tired of the Midwest's emotional performance art, sent 2 mediators to calm things down. Their mission: convince Michigan to stop threatening Ohio, while also convincing Ohio to stop being Ohio. The mediators found Governor Mason unyielding. He refused to surrender any part of the Toledo Strip and accused the administration of bowing to Ohio's political influence. Jackson, unimpressed, eventually removed Mason from office altogether, temporarily at least, which made the people of Michigan furious and only deepened their resolve. At this point, the entire situation resembled a family argument at Thanksgiving, everyone shouting, no one listening, and one relative dramatically storming off to start their own country. The Toledo War, despite its absurdity, was now national news. Americans from Boston to New Orleans read about the Michigan-Ohio border conflict and couldn't decide whether to laugh, cry, or place bets. Editorials mocked it as the War of Maps and Mosquitoes. Cartoonists drew Ohio and Michigan as dueling gentlemen whacking each other with rulers. And through it all, Toledo, the poor, muddy, long-suffering Toledo, sat quietly, still wondering who was supposed to fix the potholes. The militias remained on alert through summer, and fall, no one fired a shot, but everyone acted like they might. The war had achieved the perfect balance of tension and futility, a kind of bureaucratic Zen garden of conflict. Yet, in the background, a solution was slowly forming, one that would end the war, redraw the map, and leave everyone slightly dissatisfied in the most American way possible. But before peace could arrive, there would be one more burst of drama, one more round of speeches, and one last moment of ridiculous defiance from our boy governor, who wasn't about to let his brief taste of glory fade quietly. The swamp, as always, was ready. By late 1835, the Toledo War had settled into that special phase every pointless conflict eventually reaches, the awkward middle act. The militias were tired. The letters were repetitive. Even the mosquitoes had started to lose interest. But the politicians, the politicians were just warming up. President Andrew Jackson, a man famous for duels, dogs, and doing exactly what he wanted, was not amused. He'd hoped Michigan and Ohio would resolve their dispute quietly, maybe with a handshake and some mild name-calling. Instead, the entire Great Lakes region was one sarcastic headline away from chaos. So Jackson did what Jackson always did when faced with a delicate diplomatic situation. He improvised. He sent another round of mediators, essentially well-dressed babysitters, to both sides, with orders to make them stop pretending they were Napoleon. But when they arrived in Detroit, they discovered something inconvenient. Governor Stevens T. Mason was still in full revolutionary mood. Mason refused to compromise. He declared that Michigan's rights were inalienable, immutable, and possibly divinely ensured. He gave speeches that sounded like a mix of Shakespeare and caffeine. His supporters adored him. To them, he wasn't just a territorial governor. He was a symbol of defiance, the embodiment of Midwestern dignity wrapped in a well-pressed coat. President Jackson, meanwhile, was under pressure from Ohio's powerful political lobby. Ohio was a state, Michigan was a territory, and in Washington, statehood beat territorial enthusiasm every time. Jackson needed Ohio's support for upcoming elections. Michigan sadly had no electoral votes to threaten him with, just an angry swamp and a few thousand indignant farmers. So Jackson did what any self-respecting politician would do. He sided with the people who could actually vote for him. Officially, the administration began leaning toward Ohio's claim. Unofficially, they sent Mason a very polite letter that essentially said, "Please stop being dramatic." Mason responded with an even longer letter full of words like tyranny, injustice, and I'm not mad, just disappointed. At this point, President Jackson sighed, rubbed his temples, and finally did something decisive. He removed Mason from office. Yes, the boy governor, hero of Michigan pride, champion of cartographic righteousness, was fired by presidential. Agree now, firing a 24-year-old idealist with great hair doesn't sound like a bold move. But in Michigan, it caused an uproar. Crowds gathered in Detroit denouncing Jackson's betrayal. Newspapers called it an affront to liberty. People wore ribbons in Mason's support. In short, Michigan was furious, heartbroken, and very proud of itself. Jackson appointed a new territorial governor, John S. Horner, a mild-mannered bureaucrat from Virginia whose greatest crime was existing near a very angry population. Horner arrived in Michigan under guard, greeted not with cheers, but with the kind of cold hostility usually reserved for parking enforcement officers. Citizens refused to recognize him. Local officials ignored his orders. And in the ultimate act of passive-aggressive democracy, Michigan's legislature simply continued to operate as if Mason had never been removed. So while Washington thought it had installed a new leader, Michigan continued to follow the old one. It was political theater at its finest. A government with two governors, both claiming legitimacy, neither entirely effective. Meanwhile, on the ground, or more accurately, in the mud, the militias stayed mobilized. Ohio's men still paraded around Toledo, ensuring no one from Michigan accidentally farmed in the wrong jurisdiction. Michigan's forces lingered nearby, occasionally making stern eye contact across the border. But the longer this went on, the clearer it became that the war was costing everyone too much, not in lives but in patience and money. Michigan's militia alone was draining the treasury faster than anyone expected. Paying soldiers to stand in swamps and glare at Ohioans turned out to be surprisingly expensive. Taxes rose, tempers flared. And eventually, even the most dedicated Michiganders began asking, "Are we really doing this for Toledo?" The answer, of course, was yes. But now it was getting complicated, because in the midst of this swampy melodrama, something far more important was happening. Michigan wanted to become a state. By 1835, it had all the right qualifications: population, economy, functioning government, and a healthy sense of self-righteousness. It even drafted a state constitution, which Congress promptly ignored. Why? Because of the Toledo dispute. Congress refused to grant Michigan statehood until it resolved the border issue. In essence, Washington said, "You can join the club, but only if you stop yelling at Ohio." This placed Michigan in a bind. If it gave up Toledo, it would lose face. If it refused, it would remain a territory indefinitely. The geopolitical equivalent of being stuck in the waiting room forever. Stevens T. Mason, back in semi-retirement, but still very much the star of his own personal movie, urged resistance. He declared that Michigan would never surrender 1 inch of sacred soil. He might have even practiced that line in front of a mirror. But quietly in Washington, negotiations began. Cooler heads and slightly less muddy boots took over. Senators proposed a compromise. Ohio would keep the Toledo Strip, but Michigan would get something in return. A huge chunk of wilderness to the north called the Upper Peninsula. At the time, this offer seemed like a cruel joke. The Upper Peninsula was remote, frigid, and full of trees that didn't even have the decency to grow near anything convenient. To Michigan's delegates, it looked like a punishment, the booby prize of American geography. Still, some saw potential. The deal meant statehood. It meant recognition. It meant no more waiting. But pride, as ever, was a powerful obstacle. The Michigan legislature debated furiously. Speeches were made. Tempers flared. Someone probably waved a soggy map for emphasis. And when the vote came, the majority said no. Michigan would not give up Toledo. The territory dug in once more, determined to hold on to its swampy honor, even if it meant indefinite limbo. And that's when President Jackson, possibly tired of hearing the words Toledo Strip, played his final card. He refused to recognize Michigan's statehood until they accepted the compromise. Congress backed him up. Ohio cheered. And Michigan sulked. The standoff now entered its most absurd phase yet. Two governments pretending to be at war while secretly hoping someone else would end it. As autumn turned to winter, the militias disbanded, their boots ruined, their spirits damp, literally and figuratively. The borderlands quieted. The Toledo Strip went back to being a sleepy patch of farmland patrolled mostly by deer. But the political tension didn't fade. The people of Michigan faced a choice: swallow their pride or stay a territory forever. And while they were thinking about it, nature intervened, with a cold, hard reminder that pride doesn't keep you warm in January. Because when the winter of 1836 hit, it hit hard. The crops had failed, the treasury was empty, and even the most stubborn patriots began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, the Upper Peninsula didn't sound so bad after all. The time for grand speeches was ending. The time for practical surrender was near. But before Michigan could accept its frosty fate, it would hold one last beautifully petty event. An unofficial convention that would change everything. A meeting so controversial, so awkwardly named, and so completely unnecessary that it deserves its own chapter in the annals of American absurdity. The stage was set for the Frostbitten Convention. Winter, 1836. The people of Michigan are cold, broke, and slightly less enthusiastic about defending Toledo. The militia's gone home. The cows are unimpressed. Even the mosquitoes have packed up and left for the season. But the war, such as it was, still isn't officially over. Michigan has rejected Congress's compromise once already. The territory still insists that Toledo belongs to it, by right, by justice, and by every sacred principle of swamp ownership. But now reality has arrived wearing a very large coat and holding a very large heating bill. Governor Mason, reinstated by popular demand after his brief presidential firing, surveys the situation. The treasury is empty, the farmers are freezing, and Washington is still treating Michigan like the kid who can't sit at the adult table until he apologizes. Something has to give. So, in the depths of that bitter winter, the people of Michigan do what Americans always do when faced with hopeless circumstances. They hold a meeting. This meeting would go down in history as the Frostbitten Convention. Now, convention might make you imagine delegates in suits, banners waving, maybe a brass band. But this was 1836, in a half-frozen frontier town called Ann Arbor. The delegates arrived wrapped in blankets, muttering about frostbite and arguing about who had the worst horse ride there. The purpose? To vote, unofficially, on whether to accept Congress's offer, give up Toledo, gain the Upper Peninsula, and finally become a state. The atmosphere was tense. Half the delegates came determined to reject the deal again. The other half just wanted to go home and sit near something that was on fire. The debate dragged on for hours, punctuated by coughing, foot stomping, and the occasional remark about how no one wanted the frozen wasteland up north. Supporters of the compromise tried to sell the UP like desperate real estate agents. It's beautiful, they said. Full of trees, great for hunting, probably has minerals. They had no idea how right they were, but at the time it sounded like pure spin. Opponents shot back. We want Toledo, not a glacier. Back. And forth it went, each speech fogging the air a little more. Someone even proposed taking both, Toledo and the Upper Peninsula, which was bold, visionary, and completely ignored by Congress. Finally, after hours of debate, a vote was taken, and by a narrow margin, and possibly out of sheer frost-induced exhaustion, Michigan accepted the deal. The Toledo Strip would go to Ohio. Michigan would receive the Upper Peninsula. And in return, Congress would grant it statehood. The delegates trudged home, cold but relieved. The long, ridiculous war over a swampy border was finally and officially over. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Many Michiganders considered the Frostbitten Convention illegitimate. Unofficial, they said. Unauthorized, they said. Held in a room where you could see your breath, they said. But Congress didn't care. It was a decision. And more importantly, it ended the noise. So on January 26, 1837, Michigan was admitted to the Union as the 26th state. There was no parade, no cannon fire, just a general sense of relief and possibly chilblains. Ohio got Toledo, Michigan got the Upper Peninsula, and everyone got to stop pretending they were about to have a war. At first, Michigan sulked. Newspapers called the deal a robbery by map. Editorials complained that they'd traded fertile farmland for a mountain of snow. Citizens muttered that their new northern territory was worthless. But history, as it so often does, had the last laugh. Because beneath those forests and icy rivers, the Upper Peninsula hid a secret. A geological jackpot of iron, copper, and later, even silver. By the 1840s, prospectors discovered vast mineral deposits, sparking a boom that turned the region into one of the richest mining districts in America. The land Michigan had reluctantly accepted turned out to be its greatest treasure. As for Toledo, well, it became a perfectly fine city, respectable, industrious, a center for glassmaking and minor league baseball. But it never produced a single gold rush, and its swamps remained stubbornly swamps. In the end, Michigan's loss became an unintentional win. The frostbitten delegates had, by accident or exhaustion, voted their way into prosperity. It was perhaps the first time in history that stubbornness and hypothermia combined to produce a good outcome. Meanwhile, in Ohio, the politicians declared victory and went back to farming, building canals, and pretending they'd always wanted Toledo. The citizens of both states resumed their normal lives, occasionally telling stories about how they'd almost gone to war, and usually exaggerating their personal heroism in the process. The legend of the Toledo War began to fade. But like all good pieces of American history, it refused to disappear entirely. Because how could it? A war with no battles, one stabbing, several arrests, thousands of angry farmers, and a lifetime supply of pettiness. That's not something you forget easily. Over the years, the Toledo War became a kind of historical inside joke. Teachers mentioned it to bored students. Local newspapers ran anniversary pieces. Politicians occasionally brought it up as proof that their state's people were tough but reasonable, which is politician speak for, we didn't actually shoot anyone. And yet, beneath the humor, the Toledo War still mattered. It revealed something deep and enduring about America, about pride, geography, and the curious national talent for turning minor inconveniences into major dramas. This wasn't just a border dispute. It was an early example of American federalism, trying to figure itself out, of states and territories testing how far they could push before Washington lost its patience. It was a story about identity, about people defining themselves not by what they gained, but by what they refused to give up. It was, in short, a very polite, very muddy, very human kind of war. And though no cannon fired, though no battlefield, monuments marked the site. The echoes of that absurd conflict linger in both states' cultures. Michiganders still like to joke that Ohio can keep Toledo. Ohioans still occasionally point out that they won. Both are right, both are wrong. And both, secretly, wouldn't have it any other way. Because sometimes, the best kind of war is the one that ends with everyone slightly embarrassed but alive. So the next time someone tells you that history is just kings and generals and epic battles, remember the Toledo War, the great dignified spat over a swamp that no one really wanted, yet everyone refused to lose. It wasn't grand, it wasn't glorious, but it was unforgettable. And it proved once and for all that you don't need bloodshed to make a legend. Sometimes all you need is pride, paperwork, and one very unfortunate man named Two Stickney. When Michigan finally became a state in 1837, you might think everyone cheered, hugged, and agreed to never again argue over mud. But this is America, and Americans never forget a good grudge. In Michigan, they celebrated statehood with pride and a faint bitterness that could curdle cream. Newspapers called it a victory of perseverance. They toasted Governor Mason as a hero, a man who stood up to Washington and lived to tell about it. Songs were written, speeches were made, toasts were raised, and yet every time someone mentioned Toledo, the room went quiet. In Ohio, meanwhile, the politicians congratulated themselves. "We have defended our rights," they proclaimed. "We have secured our territory." They printed maps showing Toledo proudly nestled within Ohio's borders, as if it had always been there. They held parades. And then, once everyone got bored, they stopped talking about it entirely. The Toledo War slipped quietly into the background of American memory. For decades, it survived mostly in jokes and local lore. That weird little footnote in history. Class, right after the War of 1812, and just before Why Geography is Hard. But for the people who had lived through it, the war left scars. Not physical, but emotional, bureaucratic, and occasionally damp. Michigan, in its early years as a state, struggled financially. The militia expenses from the Toledo War had nearly bankrupted the territory, and statehood didn't magically fill the coffers. The first few years were rough. Debt, bad harvests, and a lingering feeling that the federal government owed them one. Governor Mason, still in his 20s, and riding high on public adoration, continued to serve as Michigan's first official state governor. For a while, he was unstoppable. The boy wonder who defied Washington and got away with it. But politics, like the frontier, is never kind for long. Scandals followed. His administration was accused of mishandling funds, and enemies whispered that the young governor was too proud, too reckless, too fond of glory. Within 2 years, Mason was voted out of office. He left Michigan quietly, his brief stardom fading like the last light over a frozen lake. He died young, just 31 years old, far from the swamps and arguments that had made him famous. But even now, Michigan remembers him as the boy governor, the symbol of a state's stubborn birth. As for the Upper Peninsula, that supposed consolation prize, it blossomed. By the 1840s, prospectors had discovered copper in its hills, iron in its soil, and enough lumber to build half the Midwest. Mining towns sprouted like mushrooms, and suddenly, the land that no one wanted became the economic heart of the state. Within a generation, Michigan went from grumbling about losing Toledo to quietly thinking, we actually got the better end of that deal. Ohio, of course, never admitted this. Ohio remained Ohio, industrious, practical, proud of its victory, and absolutely uninterested in revisiting the topic. Toledo developed into a thriving port city on Lake Erie, built canals, railroads, and factories. But even there, the myth of the war hung in the air like the smell of steel and river water. Citizens told stories of how their grandfathers stood watch against Michigan's invasion. No one mentioned that stood watch meant sitting on a fence post for 3 days waiting for nothing to happen. Over time, the Toledo War became a badge of local humor. Ohioans used it to tease Michiganders. Michiganders used it to tease back. It became part of a friendly rivalry that, over the years, would evolve into something much bigger. The great cultural grudge between the two states. That rivalry, the Ohio-Michigan feud, would stretch into sports, jokes, and everyday conversation. The Toledo War became its origin myth, the founding legend of Midwestern pettiness. It was the war that launched 1,000 college football chants. Meanwhile, historians, those noble scholars of everything ridiculous, started digging into the Toledo War in the late 19th century. They found old documents, dusty maps, and letters full of melodrama, and they loved it. How could they not? A war where no one died, fought by men who spent most of their time arguing about whose surveyor was less wrong. It was irresistible. Writers began to frame it as a kind of national comedy. Proof that even in the age of muskets and manifest destiny, Americans were capable of solving problems with mostly just paperwork and passive-aggressive correspondence. By the 20th century, the Toledo War had achieved near-mythic status. Local museums displayed muskets that had never been fired. Counties erected historical markers describing the conflict that almost was. Schoolchildren reenacted it with cardboard swords in great confusion. And in one of those delightful twists that history loves, the border the two sides fought over was later surveyed again, with modern equipment. And it turned out that both sides had been slightly wrong. The line was adjusted just a little. No one cared. By then, both states had moved on to more pressing matters, like inventing cars and arguing about football. But if you listen closely, say, on a quiet night by the Maumee River, when the frogs are croaking and the stars hang over, the old border, you can almost hear the echo of that absurd little conflict. A few surveyors shouting, a sheriff muttering about paperwork, a young governor making grand speeches into the cold wind, and somewhere a man named Two Stickney, polishing his penknife and wondering if he'll ever live that moment down. The war left no graves, no widows, no broken cities, just stories. And maybe that's what makes it special. Because when you strip away the legends, the Toledo War wasn't about land or law or maps. It was about pride, about the human refusal to back down, even when backing down would be easier. It was about the kind of stubborn dignity that makes people stand knee-deep in a swamp and say, "No, this mud is our mud." It's funny now, but there's something strangely noble in it. A reminder that the smallest quarrels can define us, and that history isn't made only by grand battles and famous men. Sometimes it's made by tired farmers, lost surveyors, and one bad-tempered son with a knife. And maybe that's the secret charm of the Toledo War. It's not heroic, it's not tragic, it's just human, deeply, wonderfully, sleepily human. The Toledo War might have ended in 1837, but like all great acts of American absurdity, it refused to die quietly. Sure, the muskets were gone, the militias disbanded, the swamps returned to their natural, uninterested state. But a new kind of battle was brewing, one fought not with bullets or borders, but with pride, jokes, and footballs. Because while the states had made peace on paper, in spirit, Ohio and Michigan were just getting started. It began innocently enough. The two states grew side by side, both industrious, both stubborn, both convinced the other was slightly insufferable. Ohio built railroads, factories, and cities. Michigan, armed with its new Upper Peninsula, mined copper and iron, and invented cars. They didn't compete at first. They just glared politely across Lake Erie. But as the 19th century rolled into the 20th, that polite glare evolved into a cultural staring contest. It was a rivalry built on personality. Ohio prided itself on being reliable, organized, the heart of the Midwest, a land of inventors and presidents. Michigan prided itself on independence, creativity, and the distinct pleasure of thinking Ohio took itself too seriously. And underneath it all, like a half-forgotten scar, was the memory of that ridiculous war over Toledo. The story became legend, retold at family gatherings, exaggerated in taverns, whispered with laughter in classrooms. Remember, Michiganders would say Ohio stole our city, to which Ohioans would reply, "You're welcome, it's doing fine." Then in 1897, something happened that gave the old rivalry new life. That year, two college football teams faced off for the first time. The University of Michigan Wolverines and the Ohio State University Buckeyes. It was, in hindsight, inevitable. If ever there were two teams destined to despise each other for reasons both historical and hilariously petty, it was these. From the start, the games were fierce. The players treated the field like the disputed border itself. The fans, thousands of them, dressed in maize, blue, scarlet, and gray, turned the stadium into a reenactment of 1835, but with better uniforms. Over time, the game, as it came to be known, became one of the most intense rivalries in all of American sports. The Toledo Wars spirit lived on, not in muskets, but in touchdowns, chants, and insults shouted lovingly across tailgates. Ohio fans waved signs that said, "We still have Toledo." Michigan fans responded, "Enjoy your swamp." Every November, for over a century, the two states reenact their great war. Peacefully, loudly, gloriously. It's poetic, really. A conflict that began over geography found its true home on a football field, where geography doesn't matter at all, and like the original war, the rivalry has its share of myths. Both sides tell exaggerated tales. In Michigan, the story goes that Ohio's entire personality is based on insecurity. In Ohio, they say Michigan smells like disappointment and wet leaves. Historians have found little evidence for either claim, but the tradition continues. The Toledo War even became a kind of cultural shorthand for Midwestern absurdity. Anytime the two states disagree about water rights, road maintenance, or who invented the chili dog, someone inevitably mutters, "Don't start another Toledo War." And they mean it, because the truth is, the rivalry endures precisely because of how pointless it is. It's comforting in a way, a safe, familiar feud. A reminder of the days when America's biggest problems could be solved with a sternly worded letter and a lot of mud. As time passed, both states began to embrace the joke. Towns near the old border hosted Toledo War Days festivals. Historical societies held mock reenactments, complete with costumes, fake muskets, and a guy playing two Stickney, usually holding a rubber knife and a guilty grin. Even Toledo itself got in on the fun. Once the prize of two militias, it became a symbol of reconciliation, the place where both sides could laugh about what had once been so serious. In 1915, the city hosted a centennial celebration of the war, complete with speeches, music, and absolutely no stabbings. Governors from both states attended. They shook hands, they smiled for photos. They declared that the past was forgiven, though neither could resist making a few light-hearted jabs. It was official. The Toledo War had evolved from national embarrassment to national treasure. And yet, beneath the laughter, the story still carried weight. It reminded people that the American experiment had always been messy, that state lines were drawn not by divine wisdom, but by men with compasses and bad tempers. It showed how fragile unity can be, and how humor can save it. Because really, what other country could fight an entire war over a patch of swamp and turn it into a source of collective amusement for 200 years? The Toledo War became proof that America, for all its chaos, could laugh at itself, eventually, and that's why it still matters. Every time Michigan and Ohio line up on that football field, they're not just playing a game, they're reenacting history. The muskets have been replaced with marching bands. The generals have become coaches. The letters of outrage are now tweets. But the spirit? The pride? The glorious petty passion? It's the same when the Wolverines and Buckeyes face off. You can almost hear the echoes of those 1830s militias shouting across the Maumee River. You can almost see the ghosts of surveyors rolling their eyes. You can almost smell the swamp. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in the stands, a spectral two Stickney is cheering. Knife safely tucked away this time. The Toledo War didn't just shape a border. It shaped a rivalry, a story, and a peculiar kind of Midwestern identity. Proud, stubborn, funny, and endlessly willing to argue about meaningless things. And that, perhaps, is its greatest victory. History likes to pretend it's serious. Battles, treaties, dates, dead people. It wears a suit, clears its throat, and says, "We must learn from the past." But sometimes history just trips on its own shoelaces and faceplants into a swamp. And that, dear dreamer, is where the good stuff lives. The Toledo War is one of those moments. Its history with its hair messed up, its pride slightly bruised, and its hat lost somewhere near the Maumee River. And yet somehow it matters. Because the story of the Toledo War is really a story about how people work, how pride, confusion, And paperwork can spiral into something much bigger than anyone intended. No one set out to start a war. No one wanted to build militias or dig trenches or declare martial law. They just wanted to be right. And isn't that kind of beautiful? Think about it. The entire affair, years of letters, surveys, parades, and one unfortunate stabbing, all because two groups of people couldn't agree where one line ended and another began. That's not just American history. That's human history. The Toledo War reminds us that civilization is really just a collection of people pointing at maps and saying, "I think it's this way," and then getting mad when someone disagrees. It also shows something else, something weirdly comforting. The idea that conflict doesn't have to end in tragedy. The world is full of wars that left ashes, graves, and grief. But the Toledo War left only stories and a long-running punchline. It's proof that not every disagreement has to break us. Some can just amuse us for centuries. It's also a reminder that the line between myth and history is blurry, especially in America. This is a country that's always told stories to make sense of itself. The frontier, the revolution, the gold rush, all of them have been dressed up, exaggerated, retold around campfires and dinner tables. The Toledo War fits perfectly in that pattern. It's our miniature epic, a tale of brave men standing, ankle-deep in mud, fighting for an idea no one can quite explain. It has heroes, villains, misunderstandings, and just enough absurdity to feel like folklore. The boy governor, young and defiant. The irritable surveyors waving compasses like swords. The son with the penknife, destined to live in footnotes forever. It's American mythology on a smaller, sillier scale, but it also whispers something real about who we are. Because in the end, the Toledo War wasn't about power or empire. It was about belonging, about people wanting to know where home begins and ends. When you think about it, that's all borders ever are. Lines drawn to make sense of chaos. And sometimes those lines are wrong. Sometimes they cut across rivers, forests, families, or, in this case, a swamp. But still, we draw them. And then we argue about them. And then, if we're lucky, we laugh about them. The Toledo War gives us permission to laugh at history, at government, at ourselves. It tells us that even when we take ourselves too seriously, time will eventually sand down the edges, turning rage into legend and legend into comedy. It's the story of a nation learning how to disagree without falling apart. And maybe that's why it lingers. Because America, for all its ambition, has always been a patchwork of contradictions. Brave and ridiculous, noble and petty, idealistic and tired. We fought over principles and over pride, over freedom and over fence lines. Sometimes, like in the Toledo War, we fought over mud. And maybe that's why this little conflict feels so oddly pure. There was no grand ideology, no world-changing. Just geography, confusion, and a shared unwillingness to admit mistakes. It's democracy distilled to its most human form. Everyone was a little right. Everyone was a little wrong. Everyone refused to give in. And when it was over, they found a way to move on. In that way, the Toledo War is almost hopeful. It's a blueprint for surviving disagreement with humor intact. It says, you can fight, you can argue, you can write a dozen angry letters and still end up okay, as long as you're willing to laugh about it later. And in a world that often feels like it's forgotten how to laugh, that might be the best kind of history to remember. Because the Toledo War didn't make heroes or villains. It made neighbors. And occasionally that's harder. So there it is, the Toledo War. The war with no battles, no glory, no winners, and no real point. Just lines on a map, pride in the air, and one thoroughly confused knife. It's easy to laugh at it now. And you should. It deserves to be laughed at. But it also deserves to be remembered. Not as a tragedy, but as a tiny miracle of restraint. Because for all the shouting and saber rattling, no one fired a shot in anger. The militias went home. The maps were redrawn. The Republic rolled on, and somehow from that mess of mud and stubbornness, two great states emerged, both convinced they'd won. Michigan got its Upper Peninsula, a wilderness of forests, lakes, and riches waiting beneath the soil. Ohio got Toledo, a thriving port, a city that grew from the argument itself. Both walked away with pride intact, which in politics is rarer than gold. In the end, that might be the real lesson. If you can't win, make sure no one can tell. And as the years turned into decades and the border grew mossy and quiet, the war transformed from fact into folklore. Stories softened it. Time made it funny. The pettiness became a kind of legend, proof that even serious men in uniforms can, at heart, be gloriously ridiculous. Somewhere out there in a dusty archive, a letter still sits, a governor's demand written in perfect cursive fury, insisting that the honor of his state depends on a slightly different squiggle of a river. And next to it, another letter, equally furious, equally polite, equally wrong. The ink has faded, but the tone still hums. I will not yield. We all have those moments. We draw our own little borders, between opinions, between dreams, between who we are and who we want to be. We guard them fiercely. We argue over them. Sometimes we even start our own tiny wars. And maybe that's why the Toledo War still feels familiar, even now, because deep down we recognize it. It's the eternal tug of war between pride and peace, between being right and being happy. But here's the secret. History has already shown us how it ends. The mud dries. The borders. The letters go quiet. And what's left, if we're lucky, is laughter. It's what keeps the story alive. It's why, nearly 2 centuries later, people still tell it. Not as a warning, not as a tragedy, but as a bedtime story. A reminder that sometimes the world doesn't need another epic. It just needs a funny human tale about people being their gloriously imperfect selves. Somewhere in that muddy strip of land between Ohio and Michigan, the wind still moves through the trees. The rivers still flow, indifferent to where the map says they should. The ghosts of surveyors and governors, of soldiers who never fought, of farmers who grumbled and went home. They're all resting now. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them murmuring just beneath the hum of the night. It wasn't much of a war, but it was ours. And that, dear dreamer, is how the Great Toledo War came to an end. Not with cannon fire, but with paperwork, pride, and one very confused knife. It's the kind of story that makes you shake your head and smile, because only in America could a war so small, so absurd, and so pointless become something so perfectly unforgettable. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine those long-ago soldiers standing ankle-deep in mud, puffing out their chests, waiting for a battle that never came. Imagine the governors pacing in their offices, practicing heroic speeches no one would hear. And imagine, floating just above it all, a quiet little whisper of history, equal parts foolishness and grace, reminding you that sometimes it's okay to let things go, because the map will always shift, the borders will always blur, and in the end, all we really have are the stories we tell and the laughter they leave behind. Sleep well, dear dreamer. You've just survived the most harmless war in American history.